This is Book TV's Afterwards podcast. This week, Zerlina Maxwell, MSNBC political analyst and author of the book, The End of White Politics. She offers her thoughts on identity politics and how to create a more inclusive Democratic Party. She's interviewed by Maria Kumar, CEO of Voto, Latino.
Hi, my name is Maria Teresa, and I'm so happy to be here with Zerlina Maxwell. I'm honored to have this time to discuss your vital book, The End of White Politics. This book really challenges what we have accepted as the status quo for the Democratic Party. And I think right now, as we are trying to, read into the tea leaves of 2020, it couldn't have come at a better time. This is a critique that could not be more challenged in America right now. But we also understand that it is imperative that people in the political world, Zerlina, take your book to heart and look at it as an opportunity to change the game come this election. So with that, I'd love to basically recognize, the wonderful work that you have done as an author, but as an activist, and as a political operative yourself. So I really believe that it's going to get the work that you did, the book that you've written will provide us some inside baseball that's oftentimes not part of the political politics. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to see you. I know all of us are in quarantine, so it's so nice to see people's faces and to see that they're safe and healthy because this is a scary time. So I'm so happy to be here.
So I want to get started because I think that, again, all of the work that you're doing is so relevant. And I think, and you have the bona fides, you were part of the Hillary Clinton campaign. You have your own progressive Sirius show. And both of us, I think we both got to know each other because we both provide analysis on MSNBC. Yes. And yet in the campaigns and in the mainstream media, oftentimes we forget the narratives that are propelling this incredible action right now that we're seeing in the streets and hopefully will translate into the voting booth. So talk a little bit about what that means. I know that in your book, you touch on identity politics as embracing identities other than those that are white, male, and heteronormative, and running political campaigns based on needs and experiences of those identities. And you shared that this is the future. What do you think so many people have a fundamental misunderstanding of what identity politics really are?
Well, I think that after 2016 in particular, identity politics got a bad rap. I mean, it was a term originally coined by feminists in 1977 to lay out and articulate how people who have marginalized identities can, build coalitions to attain political power. And so one of the things after 2016 we did is say, well, Hillary Clinton played identity politics by talking about racial justice, by talking about white privilege openly and directly, and talking about groups of differing identities, people with differing abilities. And she sort of had a riff in her stump about the variety of identities and how it intersects. And so what we didn't realize in 2016 is that she was talking about identity politics, but so was Donald Trump. Donald Trump was talking about white identity. And too often in politics, we center whiteness, we center white identity, we center white voters in every single aspect of our political conversations, in the message. And so my book basically lays out the fact that, wait, hold up. We can't criticize identity politics just because it's finally Black people and Latinx people and the AAPI community asserting their rights and ability to attain positions of political power and representation. Just because we're doing it doesn't make it a bad thing. Donald Trump utilized it to his benefit, and wait, we're going to be the majority soon. So maybe we should.
And that's where I want to unpack that with you. Yeah, well, that's where I want to unpack, because oftentimes when we talk about identity politics, it's oftentimes divorced from economic inequities. Right. But that really is the underlying, right? So exactly. If I apply for a job and I'm discriminated against based on who I love, then that affects my economics. If I cannot get a promotion because of the color of my skin or because I have an accent, that actually is an economic injustice. So talk about this, because when Trump talks about white grievance, he does it in a coded way, but at the end of the day, it's because everybody feels like they have less than an economic opportunity. So talk about that.
Yeah, I feel like what he played upon was a real economic anxiety in the country. And in COVID, we're seeing that unfold because people lost their jobs and their health insurance and any sense of security that they ever once maybe only had a piece of, but now they definitely know that that was an illusion. And one of the things I think is important to understand in this moment, and what Donald Trump did, is that he played into the anxiety, the real anxiety people are feeling, because, you know, we just were coming out of the greatest recession, well, before COVID, since the Great Depression. And that was impacting working class people. And the majority of minimum wage workers are women of color. So this is impacting particular communities and their ability to actually take care of themselves and their families. But Donald Trump played into a real grievance, I think, and a feeling of insecurity, but essentially pitted white voters against everyone else, saying those people over there, those Latinx people, those Black people, those people are the reason why you feel less secure in your household. That's why you feel like you have less economic security. He pitted different types of people against each other. That's why people describe his 2016 campaign as divisive. And I think that, you know, what we missed is that the reason why it worked is because America does have to deal with, in a real way, and I think part of that is why there's a racial reckoning in this moment, with the history that we've had on race and racism and white supremacy, and how we have treated people. Right.
And it's rooted, I would say, and it's rooted in our institutions, and
exactly.
It's rooted even in our political operatives on both sides of the aisle. Speak to that experience as a political operative, being the only, oftentimes maybe the only woman of color, and oftentimes maybe the only young person trying to change a democratic machine that oftentimes only brings in consultants that are from the Midwest and oftentimes just relay their own experience.
Yeah, it's really sometimes very frustrating on campaigns, but I do think that the Hillary campaign, I think you'll see it in the book, was very diverse. You know, in terms of, you know, comparing it to other presidential campaigns, she had more Black women than any campaign in history. She had, you know, many people from different communities. The problem is with an organization of that size, what ends up happening is you're still the only Black person in a meeting.
Exactly right.
And you're running a campaign against Donald Trump, who's being explicitly racist and divisive like on that issue specifically. So it's very important to have people in the room who come from those backgrounds that are being attacked directly, and also who understand racism and white supremacy and white privilege in particular, and how it manifests in our world, how it impacts people's lives, how it's infused in our policy and in our messaging and in our media, and how all of that works together. And for me, on the inside, it was like, you know, sometimes screaming into the void a little bit, like being like, am I the only one that
sometimes
sees this? Sometimes, you know,
I mean, let's be honest. Yeah, I mean, let's be honest. I think one of the challenges, and this is why it is so difficult, because 40% of America are people of color. I'm talking about 135 million of us who are strong. That my children who are 7 and 8 and 6, because if we just had a birthday, represent the first majority minority community in this country. But if we were to look at the fact that 40% of us are the ones that are, you know, of people of color communities, but when it comes to electing a Democrat, it is the communities of color disproportionately and young white women disproportionately that bring in that president to power. But those numbers, that parity is not reflected in those campaigns.
Absolutely not. I mean, that's one of the points that I highlight in the book that I think people need to focus on and highlight. You don't need to win a majority of the white vote in order to win a presidential election. Now, this is all, it all breaks down different when you go to congressional districts, depending upon the particular constituency. But for the most part, you're right. On the Democratic side, in order to elect Democrats, you need a coalition of diverse communities. Diverse communities meaning Black, brown, AAPI, young people, single unmarried women, single women, and because for the most part, you know, married white women vote for Republicans, right? We have to just look at the data, right? We just look at the history of who's voted for who, and then we say, well, who's normally on our side?
Well, like white males have not voted. A majority white males have not voted for a Democratic president since LBJ. Right. That's over 50 years ago, right? So that's the last. So when we keep talking about how do we bring these Trump voters back, what I'm hearing you say, and what's been my experience, why focus on the decrease while you have a whole open market of unregistered, disproportionately young people of color that would welcome your politics because that's what they're protesting.
That's
Speak
exactly
to that.
right. Well, I think that what we've seen in the COVID era, and you've seen so many young people, Gen Z, go into the streets. A lot of these movements and protests are being led by young women of color. I love that, young Black women, Black women. It's like it's so inspiring. But part of what I think the Democratic Party has an opportunity in this moment. You can engage those people directly on the issues that they care about, because ultimately, I think there are shared goals. They may not be the specific, bill or whatever, Medicare for all policy and all of the details, but certainly health insurance for more people is something that everybody agrees upon. Equality and justice under the law are things that people are literally protesting now. They can all agree upon those goals. And so I think that what's missing is that those people being represented within campaigns. One of the things I talk about in the book is, there's no campaign school for little Black kids. Now, when I wrote the book, there were a few examples of campaign organizations like Color Pack and, organizations that Jessica Bird's doing work in training people to run for office. But I really think that the pipeline of young staffers of color, if you're at home and you've graduated and you don't have your internship, or, you're a high school student waiting to go back to school, get involved in a campaign virtually. Because it's that kind of hands-on experience that allows people to impact the world around them. And I think that sometimes, people only think that protesting and activism is a way to be engaged. But I also think working on campaigns, to your point about the fact that you can be the only one, we wouldn't be the only one if we had everyone, go into campaigns and try to work there.
So what is your advice for diversification in the campaigns? Because you and I both know that it gets to a certain point that it's sort of like media, right? Oftentimes it's not the person that is well-versed, it's the person you know. How do they break through? And one of my critiques historically of many campaigns is that they bring in these really bright young people of color to knock on doors to do all the work, but then they don't see them in leadership roles, but they do see them in the roles that are not necessarily, they're the most passionate and the most engaged, but not necessarily the best paid.
Right. Well, that's a good point too, because I think a lot of times, and Mignon Moore, who worked as a senior advisor on the campaign in 2016 with me, she always talked about how traditionally Democratic campaigns would put the people of color in the quote field, out knocking on doors, as you said, and how even the optics of that is all wrong. And that, their staged protest in 1988 was essentially to assert the fact that we need to be in the, at the seat of power, at the table where the decisions are being made. So part of it is hiring Black and brown staff and putting them in all different aspects of the campaign. I mean, one of the cooler things about the 16 campaign, even though I have certain critiques of it, is the presence of Black women in the tech and digital departments. A Black woman created I'm With Her, a Black woman, coded the website, HillaryClinton.com. So just understanding that you need those people reflected in all aspects, because then you also, you have sort of that diverse set of eyes. And you those blind spots that always come up when a campaign may put out messaging that seems tone deaf or misses the mark, you'll have people in there to make sure you don't have so many missteps as well.
So what would be your recommendation to the Joe Biden campaign? I know that there was a critique in your book. What would be your recommendation right now because he is the nominee?
He needs to do a mass hiring of young women of color that are either on summer break, at home for high school, maybe their sorority, they can get connected that way on their campuses. But there needs to be a very concerted effort to engage young, diverse voters so that they actually feel seen. I mean, Stacey Abrams talks about identity politics sort of being the flip side, or I see it sort of as the flip side as I don't see color. And she puts it this way. She says, I see you, right? I see sort of the fulsome, fulsomeness of your experiences and who you are. I see that you're a woman. I see that you're Black. Like I see that, and that matters, right? And I think that's a really important thing. So I think what Joe Biden needs to do is he needs to make the constituencies that he would like to engage and turn out, hopefully in November, he needs to make them feel seen and heard. So he has to have movement leaders engage directly with the campaign. They need to be speaking on a regular basis. I hope they are. I know that some of this they're doing, but some of this I don't see it enough on the out, from the outside. And that's the critique that I think a lot of people had in 2016. And we'd be like, well, we are doing it. And then they'd be like, well, I didn't see it. And so that's a part of it too.
And that is getting into the Nixon crannies. And I think that, most traditional campaigns are used to doing television advertising, and they don't recognize that that oftentimes the young people, the voters that you want, are not on TV. They're not watching TV, right? And so
they're absolutely not.
One of the things, absolutely not. I mean, what my favorite so far is the whole fact. One of my favorites is, and when people say, well, what is really the power of youth and youth organizing? All we need to show now is what happened during the Trump rally, where K-pop mobilized these young people worldwide to bring up tickets to his Tulsa rally. And they expected, his campaign manager was touting that over 1 million people were coming because of the demand, and less than 6,000 showed up. Yeah. And then they got trolled by the Gen Zers. But I point to that because one of the things that you talk about very much is about hashtag kids and what that means. And when you say that, Biden is not connecting, we know that at Voto, we know he's not connecting. We just did a survey where 46 of young Latinos expected to participate, and even then they were soft. That is a code red for me, because unlike in African American and white communities where the parents force their kids to go vote, it's the young Latinos that go force their parents to go vote. So talk a little about this hashtag kids, the power of their voice, and how do you communicate to them?
Well, I think that the hashtag kids is a chapter about the Gen Z and sort of younger millennial activism, from Black Lives Matter to Parkland, March for Our Lives. Also DACA, kids who have been using social media to organize.
They're natives, right? They're social media. They're native speakers. I like to call them.
They understand how to use it as a tool. They know that it's not the be all end all. They know that, I think there was a lot of critiques of hashtag activism, which is why I wanted to write this chapter, because I've long been a proponent of Twitter as a space to organize, but also to teach and have conversations and to create a space to have a dialogue. Well, it used to be better for this, but you could have sort of a back and forth about something maybe that was uncomfortable to talk about in person. We've seen this with Me Too. We've seen this with Yes All Women and Black Lives Matter. So one of the things I think is really important about the hashtag kids chapter is to understand that the kids get intersectionality. They understand that identity matters. They understand that you should respect people's identity. They understand that people who have different backgrounds should be treated the same. Like in a fundamental core way, right. in a different way than maybe our parents or even my generation. Because I think that they've grown up with, income inequality. They've grown up with, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. They've grown up with, systemic issues being right in their faces. And then they also have the ability to go on TikTok and learn about white supremacy, because that's the content that they're watching, and dance videos too. But they're learning about it all. And I think that the TikTok moment was important to highlight, I think, and I'm glad that you brought it up, because it's one of my favorite things, and it's an evidence that Joe Biden already has an army.
Right.
Right. And so all he needs to do is, well, I guess enlist them is the word, but engage them, where they are. I read a couple things recently where they were sort of debating whether or not they should have a presence on TikTok, because it seemed odd because he's so much older that he would, but I'm like, it doesn't have to be him, right. But you engage those influencers to speak in the message, and then they're speaking to their own people. And it's actually a validation that Joe Biden is the best choice right now. I mean, I think a lot of people, there's been a debate on Twitter this week.
But I think that's really important. But I think what you have to highlight, right, is that this generation seems to have a different savvy. And I heard it echoed from AOC, and you just said it again. It's like, it's this idea, it's an understanding that we have to have a more pragmatic look of our candidates. And this this generation is interested, saying, I don't need to be in love, but I need to know that he's the right choice right now. And I don't think that has been communicated enough to them. So unpack that, because I think that everybody expects, the Barack Obama moment. At least political operatives do, pundits do. But these kids have been, as you mentioned, we started out of war in Iraq. They've had the worst recession in their recent memory. That oftentimes they live in food insecurity. They are of a different savvy and I'd say less coddled generation. I know that people don't give them that credit, but when I see the extensive of what the hardships they've faced, especially among, I would say, Black and brown communities disproportionately, whether we're talking about Black Lives Matter or we're talking about family separation and the anxiety of DACA, if you don't know if you can stay here. Speak to how I deeply believe, and I think that's what your book is getting to with this hashtag, is that they have a different level of maturity, but they do expect authenticity. Right.
I think they don't want to hear platitudes.
Right.
Because they understand that platitudes don't lead to action. Platitudes are you telling me what I want to hear. I want you to go do the thing that it will help me. Right. That will help my family have more security and safety. And I think that fundamentally, I think this generation, because some of the crises that we're facing, I mean, when I wrote this book, it was all before COVID. I had no idea there was going to be a pandemic. However, I was planning.
I wish you had told me.
I know. I had no idea.
However, you're the only one. You were the only.
I didn't know. I had no idea. But I was preparing for disaster because fundamentally, like as soon as Trump was elected, and in part, I joined the campaign on that impulse of like, it might be the end of the world. Let me go do my part. And also believing that Hillary could do a good job as president. I do believe that she could be a good president, but also I was afraid of Donald Trump. And so when he won, I was like preparing for the end of the world. I mean, literally. And that was way before the thought of we even knew what COVID was.
But Zerlina, I think you are flagging what people of color pundits and analysts were saying about Donald Trump. And there was it was a general folks that are making decisions on the stories we cover that anxiety was ill-founded. But the moment he went down the elevator, he told us who he was, right? And so I oftentimes, Zerlina, I'm surprised of people being surprised at how terrible he is. I said, he's always told us. So what is that? I guess that goes back to the sensibility of these young Black and brown activists that are, to your point, they're looking for authenticity, trying to get people to, meet them where they are, to meet their needs. How does that change in a pandemic where we see people marching for George Floyd and expecting change while the rest of the world is upturned? And I say this because unlike, counter to most belief, Voto, we just did a poll and we found that 75% of Latinos are in lockstep with Black Lives Matter and in allyship. And when we look at younger voters that we were talking about, that's even bigger. What significance do you see as that if you're reading the tea leaves? And what's the opportunity?
I think the opportunity is that that's a winning coalition of voters, but not just because, they can potentially win elections, but they can reshape legislatures, they can reshape Congress, they can reshape the entire country. Because when you have voting power, when you have the numbers, and then you can build a coalition that can then elect the people that can help your communities, I mean, that is why voter suppression is a strategy. That is why they try to suppress the votes of Black and brown people. They understand the power of the vote. I think about that all the time because I have family that marched in Selma. And I just think about the fact that they had to risk their lives for my ability to go vote. But think about how powerful that vote must be. That people would threaten the lives or potentially murder others, beat others on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, just so that I could participate in this democracy. So it must be something worth fighting for.
Well, and this brings me to one of the most powerful quotes in your book that I found quite moving. And it says, and basically you state, when you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. As someone who has studied politics extensively, what do you think is one of the most root causes of the racist rhetoric? And how does that inflame, how does the president use that? And how do we combat it?
Well, I talk about this on SiriusXM on Signal Boost every day with my co-host because she's a white woman and I'm a Black woman and we're both feminists, intersectional feminists. So we have great conversations about, just how we're raised differently, right? If you're in a body and you have white skin, then you are raised differently. People treat you differently, and you don't realize it sometimes. It's just how it is. And there are a lot of implicit messages.
Right. They don't walk in and they don't feel people clutching their purses or people being followed around in department stores because they're not sure if you could afford something. I mean, those are microaggressions that we are aware of.
Exactly. And they add up. The thing is that I think people, I never like calling it micro because I feel like by the end of the day, it feels not micro. It feels,
but you're right. I mean, they're microaggressions that make up, because that person, whoever followed you in the store forgets about you, but you get in your car and you're still fuming about it, right?
I'm still fuming.
Yep. No, I mean, I'm saying like that. Yes. I relate. I understand. Yes.
Yeah, so I think that, the conversation that we have as a Black woman and a white woman is essentially about the fact that white children are raised, whether explicitly or implicitly, because of the culture they consume, because of what's on TV, what's on magazines, who's in positions of power, that white people are better. They're better. That's what they're taught. They don't see a Black president until Barack Obama. They don't see many of the CEOs be anything other than white men, in very few cases, right? And so I think when you're accustomed to just see yourself reflected back, but in the best possible way, in the positions of power and authority and privilege and success, and the image of other types of people you see are always negative or stereotyped or racist, flat out racist,
right.
That has an effect. Not everybody realizes that they have these biases, but I always say that everybody has implicit biases because we grow up in this country. And we're consuming all of that pop culture. We're consuming all of that messaging, and then we treat people differently, better or worse. I remember when I was a little kid, in school, I was the only Black child until 9th grade. And so that had an impact on my ability to recognize that I was being treated differently because I was the only one who was different. So it was eye-opening at I think it was 3rd grade when I was like, okay, when I'm excited and I know the answer and I get, really aggressive about it, I get reprimanded. I get told, wait your turn. Yep. Literally. I was told oh no, wait your turn. But when the white boys usually would do it, they would get praised. I noticed that disparity. And then you have multiply that kind of experience, in perpetuity. And that's the experience of a person who's not white. And so that has an effect on how you behave as an adult, and it has an effect on how you treat people around you. I think, the debate we're having currently about people not wearing masks is also a manifestation of this privilege. Of not having to be bothered to protect other people because you've heard on the news that maybe Black and brown communities are being disproportionately impacted, and so that's not me, that's not my community.
Well, I'm not an essential, right? Well, and I'm not the essential worker, and I'm not the person that has to get. I have the privilege of staying at home and going to the lake and to the beach if I wish. So. I'm in total alignment and agreement. I think that is what is interesting. Voto Latino participated in the 21st Century Policing Task Force with President Obama, trying to change the culture of police because that seemed to be the most systemic way to enact change at the time. And one of the things that was highlighted that speaks to your point of how people of color are portrayed in media makes an impact on policing, because it turned out that the majority of white police officers were coming from very rural small towns and then placed in the middle of urban centers. And so having conversations, recognizing that the only time they ever had they saw an interaction of a Black person or a Latino, in the case of a Black person, the images of law and order, this is true, law and order helped form that they were, drug addicts, or that they carried guns, or they were incredibly violent. And in the case of Latinos, that they were domestic workers, undocumented, breaking the law. And so if you can imagine someone from those formative years being from a very rural area, meeting a person of color, in a place where they're trying to de-escalate, but they have already been conditioned to believe that person is going to hurt them no matter what. You could imagine those reactions, right? And so I think and you see that. You see that in so many of these videos.
unfortunately, you see that moment where the reaction is to harm in defense because, they're quote unquote scared for their lives. But I think we've also seen videos where the police and how they treat white people they are arresting
stark differently because they have different images of them.
Exactly.
They have, it's part of the community. So, but I want to talk about and I think something that you point out that was also very important, because the tendency of having this aggression and especially this, racist rhetoric is always speak in misogynistic language coming from the right has always, it's almost like, oh, we don't do this on the progressives, but you talk specifically about in your a whole chapter about the Bernie bros, and you're running with them during the 2016 presidential election. And I quote, "To this very day, if I criticize Bernie online or on television, my mentions and social media profiles are bombarded by angry supporters harassing me in an attempt to silence my Bernie dissent." Can you expand on why you felt that was important to highlight this particular behavior coming from the left?
Well, because I think we're better than this. We're the party that, at least in principle, cares about equality and justice and treating people fairly. And I don't understand how you can, see the efficacy of Medicare for all because you care so much about the health and security and safety of your fellow Americans. You're for Medicare for all. And the people that don't support Bernie Sanders, the tweet that I got all the time was like, "You just want people to die." I'm like, no, I literally do not. Like, I literally want Medicare for all as well.
Would people really say that to you?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. And in addition, I think, when you're not, lockstep in with what they want, then it was, a silencing tactic. I think either they were, bombarding my social media profiles, calling me names. I mean, I muted a lot of it because I just got so much of it that after a while you just, mute it. It doesn't really exist in because I can't let it sort of get inside. I can't internalize the feedback of people that I don't know. But I also, it's very toxic. And I called it out because it exists. It's a thing that is happening and we need to deal with it. And one of the ways in which we can deal with it is to be honest about the fact that it was happening. And it was happening, and that there was a certain overlap between some of the impulses, the misogyny, the racism, that women of color were, publicly attacked or trolled, if you will. I don't like the word trolls because it dehumanizes the person doing the harm. And so I call them a-hole, but we can't. So I
C-SPAN, I don't think you can use that.
But I don't like trolls because I feel like trolls makes it sound like it's not a person. It is a person making a decision to send a harmful or hateful comment to another person. And on our side, I feel like we should not have a tolerance for that. I wanted Bernie Sanders himself to speak to how it was incredibly inappropriate in the progressive side of the political spectrum to tolerate misogyny and racism among his supporters and even among some of his staff, frankly. So I think, the reckoning around that we still have work to do. But I do think that, it's not all of his supporters. It never is all of anything. And it's only a small group of what is a large and diverse group of Bernie's coalition, right? So one of the other points that I make in the book, which is important to note, is that there are young Latinos and young Black people who support Bernie Sanders, but their voices are being obscured because these other voices with the ugly messaging are loud and angry. And so they're actually harming their larger, goal and movement by not, fully confronting those in their own movement that, are perpetuating some of the same behaviors we see from some of the Trump supporters.
And so how does that piece of it, how does that translate into the coalition that you and I have discussed oftentimes that is needed? If you have a segment of Bernie bros that say, my way or the highway, or that bleeds into what we are constantly on the progressive side trying to combat. And we're trying to have an elevated discussion so that we could actually provide solutions to a lot of these communities. What does that look like for that coalition that is needed to win in November?
Well, I look at it like this. I mean, it's such a small group of people on the progressive left that I feel like either, they'll see the light and, they can be like, okay, I was kind of a jerk about it, but we all agree that we do want some sort of universal health care. Medicare for all would be ideal, but somebody's going to have to go in and negotiate with the Republicans for that. So, we may not get everything we want, but that doesn't mean the person that went in to do the negotiating is a sellout or, more negative for us than the Republicans. Again, I think, we have to be relative about it and fair about it. And I think the coalition that we're trying to build certainly includes white progressives, but fundamentally the core of it is people of color. And so, for the folks that are like, well, the Trump supporters, they were just, they had economic anxiety. They weren't racist, right? That Bernie Sanders said something to that effect. Amy Klobuchar has said something to that effect. I'm tired of hearing that because Donald Trump caged children. And he called, Mexicans rapists. He asked the first Black president for his birth certificate. Those are just 3 examples that I would like to cite to say that I don't have to wonder if he's racist.
But
right?
to your point it's that it's not the rhetoric; it's his policy.
It's more the policy.
It's his policy that he's racist.
Harming. He's actually harming those communities that he's talking badly about. To your point.
Right. And so one of the, and you mentioned it again, is like you need a coalition in order to win. And oftentimes, in the book, you highlight the importance of Black and brown voters. Talk a little bit about, unpack that, because most people don't realize that together, because there's so much alignment in the issues, whether we are talking about policing, whether we're talking about Black Lives Matter, where we're talking about healthcare, specifically around with young Black and brown voters. What is that potential? Talk about Texas, talk about California.
Yeah. So Texas and California are the 2 states in the country where Latinx voters are already the majority of the electorate. And so you see just that alone, that white voters are a minority. And I don't even like to say minority.
I don't either. I found myself saying it earlier. Yeah. It's like, it's terrible.
So in the book, I think I say, just say white voters are going to be a minority. It's okay. It won't hurt. You know what I mean? People just try to avoid saying it like it's going to hurt them. I'm like, no, it's okay. And I understand that you were raised in a country where you're calling groups of other people minorities. Now you are going to be a minority.
Right.
Just internalize that a little bit. Because that doesn't mean that you're going to be treated how, white people have treated minorities. It just means that, the ability to access power is different. So the coalition we can build between Black and brown communities can be around issues like racial justice and healthcare, income inequality, and also the idea that, there are specific needs that communities need. So Black and brown communities need big investments in education and reinvestments from the police department to services in actual communities. I mean, these are practical things, and I think
they are the same within the Latino community, right? Those are the same. And I also, oftentimes when we talk about this idea of even climate change, we get left out.
Yeah.
But our communities are disproportionately impacted by climate injustice. Exactly. And the food deserts, and it's all compounded. And I think what your book is trying to raise the flag of is that the future is born, the future is here. And how are we preparing America for that diversity that is our richness if we know how to provide the resources to lift all boats? Speak to that.
Well, I feel like, part of what we have to snap out of is the fact that we're just so used to focusing on whiteness and everything. I mean, it's every single thing. I remember as a little girl, as I said, I was the only Black child. And so, I would walk into the store and I'd look at the magazines and it would be all white faces and maybe Oprah, but then that was it. And so I feel like representation is a piece of this also. People want to see themselves reflected back. The fact that there's no Latinx television show on TV right now, 0. That the fact that, a lot of shows get pegged as like a Black show or a Latinx show, because of the majority makeup of the cast. I mean, I just did that too, but I think to make the point that we're lacking in representation, not that a show that has Latinx actors would be pegged as that. But
really, I think your point is so valid, is that the reason we could actually say that Donald Trump came into power was because the country demographically is changing so quickly.
Yes.
And all of a sudden neighbors looked up and said, I don't recognize my neighbor and I don't feel secure. And instead of having a media that has been talking about our stories, bringing the country along to the reality that for the very first time, there'll be 12 million more young voters than baby boomers who are 2/3 young people of color. Right. So it's all of a sudden like we woke up in 2020 and we're like, oh my gosh, we're brown and black, which is not the case. And that's the whole point of your book. And so I want to ask you.
I'm trying to tell you guys.
and I guess this is probably why we do the work that we do. It's like, yes, but this is where because people say, well, that seems so theoretical. But in your book, you mentioned the hypocrisy of how Black women who are running for office are treated versus how white men are treated. Specifically, you mentioned how Mayor Pete Buttigieg was able to mount a very successful campaign with little experience. What's some of the steps that Democrats can take to ensure that women of color are given the same opportunities for success?
So one of the things that we really need to do as a party, and I'm so glad to see, Quentin and Stephanie James and Jessica Byrd, and also even Higher Heights in terms of sort of the funding and financing of campaigns and supporting campaigns. But there needs to be more infrastructure in place that not only, trains candidates, but also trains operatives. Because if you don't have diversity in terms of operatives and, sort of that training ground for people who eventually could run for office, then you're never going to have the representation that you need to sort of reflect the makeup of the electorate. So I think fundamentally for me, what's missing on our side is the infrastructure to build that political power through, staffing campaigns, staffing legislative offices, and also having people run for office. I mean, some of the organizations that do this work, they're new. They just started. So, we're just in the beginning of this. But I think that's where a lot of the investment needs to happen. I mean, in terms of when you're already running, so in the case of Kamala Harris, I think what we need to do as a progressive movement is be honest about the ways in which Black women are taxed and women generally, women candidates, their mistakes are taxed and weighed more heavily than the men. And
you think of what just happened to Katie Hill, right? I mean, Katie Hill is a perfect example to unpack the fact that her ex-husband was about to leak nude photos of her, and she felt that her career had ended. Whereas that was not the case even when Anthony Weiner did the same thing. He thought he could have another go at it. So
there's a few members of Congress who they're either still in there or they went on a lot longer than you thought they could because they were men. And I think that, first of all, it's so rare for a woman politician in elected office to have a scandal that even has any of the characteristics in terms of what Katie Hill dealt with in terms of the misogyny and the revenge nature of that particular.
Well, and it seemed like small potatoes, right? Compared to what we're experiencing at the White House, right? Like, I mean, we actually have receipts for the other guy.
Right. I mean, what's upsetting about it is I think we're not honest about the double standards. So, for example, Pete Buttigieg is basically my age. We're around the same age. And this is, I think, why I had such a visceral response. Because I know that as a woman of color, I could not show up at a CNN town hall running for president and tell everyone that I'll get to the details of my policy later. Like, Jake Tapper would stop the conversation. He wouldn't continue talking to me because I'm not a serious candidate for president.
Right. But I think you even missed a spot. The reason he was on that stage was because donors believed he could do it. But if, as a woman of color, even trying to get capital,
they wouldn't finance my campaign.
Right.
I wouldn't get any money, is what I'm saying. And I think that that's sort of the point. I mean, Kamala Harris obviously had to end her presidential campaign because of the slow fundraising, and that's too often what happens with candidates of color and women. Who, for some reason, people don't trust them with their money without them having, proved that they could do the thing. And men don't have to prove.
And even then, there's a big question, right? Even there's, exactly. I love in the progressive movement. You talk a little bit about the donor community and the billionaires, and I would love you to dig in that. But I'm always struck by individuals that say, I really believe in in funding the Latinx community. I really believe in funding the African American community, and then they go give the money to someone who doesn't wake up every morning thinking of how to actually bring us under the fold. Speak to that privilege, because to me it's mind blowing, right? It's like you're not. It's kind of like in politics where the campaigns oftentimes do not reflect the people that they're trying to woo. It's the same thing when it comes to those who invest.
Oh, exactly. They don't give money to people who haven't traditionally been given money for or been invested in. And so that just makes the cycle. It goes around and around and around. And the same people are being put in positions of power. The same people are being hired to put elected officials into office. And then it just keeps going. And then the chief of staff becomes the candidate. And then we just keep doing it again. And we're just going to keep doing it again.
It's Groundhog Day. You invented it.
Like, could we not right. do that? And I think, to the point that a lot of people say is like, identity politics is you just want to elect Black people because they're Black. And I'm like, no, but it is helpful to have somebody who is Black be in a position of power, because that person has lived in a Black body their whole life. And that they're going to bring that perspective to policy. So that's why it's so important. It's not because I want to see a picture with, diversity. That's nice. But it's about the perspective.
Well, it's perspective. And when people say, well, my vote doesn't matter, I point to the fact that for the very first time during the 2018 election, Generation X, Y, Z voted in the most diverse government in the House that we'd ever seen. And if you ask me, well, why does diversity matter? Now there's 400 pieces of legislation that's a blueprint of rising the tide on everyone. And that would not have been the case had we not have this diverse body that was ushered in by a diverse group of Americans, to your point. And so one of the things that as we come to a close, I really want to ask you is that young women listening to this conversation, Zerlina, they might be saying, oh my goodness, I thought that the political career was for me, but maybe I don't belong in that space because it is either so hard or there's so many barriers. What advice do you give them? Because I am of the mind that we actually need to flood the zone with young leadership, because to your point earlier, they don't need the culture shift that being gay is okay and having, Black Lives Matters, that DACA should be a right, and that the climate is on fire. They have grown up where in a world where we don't have to convince them that to be true. But listening to our conversation, they might have trepidation of jumping in. What's your advice?
Well, I always say that, I understand that it appears that the system is not so fair all the time. We all know that. But I also say that, your right to vote is powerful. If it weren't, they wouldn't be trying so hard to take it away. And, you have to participate in the process in order to get to the change you want. So don't fall back on the cynicism of it's too hard, it won't matter, my vote won't matter, it won't even count. If we all collectively, go and participate or run ourselves, because you don't have to run.
So what's your advice for a young person running? Because I think that and AOC, I think she broke the mold because she went immediately for office. Right. And people say, well, how did she do this? I said, well, young people happen to have aged into her demographic. Right. And we see young people aging in all the time now because Generation Z is the largest generation. So exactly. But they don't have to aim for Congress. What other positions can they aim for? I think sometimes people don't see it.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, run for school board, run for city council, run for your community board. In New York City, they have community boards in the different boroughs all around New York City. You can run for Congress. You can also run for state legislators. State legislatures in most states are not full-time positions. So you can be a state legislator and work your regular job at 30. I've met state legislators in New York that are my age or like 28, when they were elected. It's really exciting. The other thing I would remind people is that if you are, looking at running for office of any kind, and you're worried that you don't have the qualifications, I want you to remember that Matt Gaetz is in Congress, and that Louis Gohmert's in Congress, and that there are a lot of men.
Go look them up if you don't know who they are.
If you don't know who they are, look them up. But there are men in Congress who never questioned whether or not they were right for the job or had the right experience. Clearly, they don't, and they're in office, right? Multiple terms. So it's important to say, look, if you think that there's a problem in your community that needs solving, figure out what role it is in whether or not you can run for it to go solve it. Because that's the majority of women run for office to solve a specific problem, like potholes or something like that. So I think, women we're solutions oriented. We're more willing to compromise once in office. And so having more of us in there would just make for a better government. So if you're a young woman out there, don't just, you don't have to be AOC on the first try, but try to be a leader within your community, to improve the problems around you. Try that first. And then additionally, you can virtually volunteer or work on the Biden campaign. I would recommend doing that. Presidential campaigns are the best experience for every job. You learn all the skills for every job.
It's true. Actually, I actually believe that to be true if you're a staff for that. Absolutely. And so in your book, you talk very much about white politics and the importance of focusing on people of color and to make the change the Democratic agenda wants. What is your advice for white allies? How can they present their best self? How can they actually ensure that there is cultural change?
Well, I think part of the problem is the lack of acknowledgement that white privilege exists first, but also that they benefit from it. Because I think, oftentimes the sort of comeback when you're talking about white privilege is, well, I'm not privileged, I'm not rich, I don't have that. And then I always, use a different example. Did you ever think about what you were wearing before you went for a jog? Because you might be shot in that outfit. Like somebody would have mistaken you for a burglar and killed you. And then the second part that I always have to add on, then no one would get in trouble for it. Like literally you'd be killed. And then also the system says it didn't matter. No one's even going to be held accountable because there's always the two parts to the injustice there. Right. So if you've never had that thought, that's privilege. And it's easy to acknowledge that that's a privilege that you enjoy. That doesn't make you a bad person. Right. But you also have to sort of be an accomplice in trying to dismantle the systems that are making it possible for Black people to repeatedly be killed. And then also secondarily, nobody gets in trouble for that. I think valuing Black lives is both, recognizing the ways in which you do not have to deal with those same harms potentially because you benefit, you have the benefit of white skin, but also raising kids that have that, the anti-racist mindset, to quote, the #1 bestseller, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and,
right.
Who do treat people, not, I think there's something to be said for the generation of people that were like, I don't see color. Like, don't raise your kids like that. No. Raise your kids to see and validate, acknowledge difference, and really learn to embrace it. Because I think that's what makes America cool. Honestly, and fundamentally. And I think the younger generation, I think their creativity around difference, their ability, when I go on TikTok, it's like dance videos and tutorials about white supremacy. Right. They're a different breed. Right. This generation, they care about. But I think we need to
speak to that. And I think I think they care about it in a deep way. And, when you say, diversity in America is cool, the only other person that I know other entity that really understands that is Russia, right? Yeah. And that's for a whole different conversation. But the reason that they're trying to create this animus among the tribes that is because they believe that is our greatest strength. Yeah. And so it is this diversity of richness that I believe deeply prepares us for our future, but we do have to be vocal and speak those conversations. And your book does that. It really sheds light on these fundamental pieces that almost sometimes even the mechanics of things that we take for granted because it's just a system that is versus what should it be, especially when we recognize that if we want to change the White House and Congress and the state legislators, there's a vast group of people that we're not talking to. And it's because we don't have the right people helping usher them into making the right decisions in candidates' ears. And with that, I know that we are facing tremendous chaos. We are facing, I keep saying, we have a pandemic. We're on the eve of economic depression. And we also have the 1960 level riots in the streets. Mm-hmm. All of it together, my mom always said, God doesn't give you what you cannot withstand. So clearly our generation can withstand this. But what gives you hope at the end of the day, right? Because there's so much anxiety. what is the purpose? What gives you hope?
Well, I've been thinking a lot during pandemic about the fact that this one big timeout that we're on is almost the universe sort of forcing us to reflect upon some of our mistakes. Namely voting Donald Trump into the White House, despite all the evidence of, the racism, misogyny, bigotry, all of that, but just really unfitness, right? So for me, I wasn't afraid of the racism. I was upset by the racism. I was afraid of the deportation, the potential for deportation forces. I remember that was a big conversation among staffers on the campaign, the fear of that, and understanding that communities that would be directly impacted, they were in just a state of fear consistently. And so I think, in this moment, I think pandemic, it allows us time to reflect. Some people don't have time because they have kids and they have to be teachers and full-time employees. So caveat. But I do think a lot of us are sort of thinking about our mortality. We're thinking about the ways in which we care about other people around us, right? We're having a debate over wearing masks. As the daughter of a scientist, I'm screaming into the void all the time. Like, what do you mean?
The world is scratching their heads. They don't understand that.
They don't understand what's wrong with us.
Right. So I guess, as we conclude the conversation, I just want to give you the last word of what do you think is, the biggest opportunity when someone picks up white politics?
Well, I think that the biggest opportunity is understanding your part within a larger, historical framework, right? You're somebody who exists in a time where America is going to be minority white by 2045. That has never happened. So that's sort of, if you're in this moment, like this is a moment where you're living through literal history. I think we feel that viscerally when we look outside. But I also think that, everybody has a part to play in this. So you're a voter. But one of the stories that I always tell from the Obama campaign in 2007, before I actually joined in 2008, is when I was registering voters in New Jersey before I moved to Virginia to work for the campaign. And the girl who was in charge was 17 and she wouldn't even be 18 by the election day. And I was like, why are you here? And she was like, well, I have to live in the country. And I was like,
put you in your place.
Yeah, I was like, I am dumb. And then she said, well, I'm one vote. But if I registered 100 people today, that's 100 votes. And I was like, math.
Yes. Yeah. Math. It's math. I'm here because of math.
Yeah, math. So I feel like, fundamentally understanding that everybody can participate. That's the cool thing about this country. We can all participate. I mean, if you paint about Joe Biden, paint about the election, paint about, the issues that we care about. If you sing a song, if you write poetry, do that. Like everybody can participate.
That's exactly right. And I think that's right. I mean, sometimes people ask me, well, what can I do? I'm like, well, what's your talent? Contribute your talent to the movement because we need everyone's talent to defeat the dark force. And with that, Zerlina, I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for writing The End of White Politics. I think it could not have come a better time. Folks, please pick it up. I think that we'll all see ourselves in the story, but also it's a roadmap to the solution. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm Maria Teresa Kumar. To take a spin off of what Zerlina said is register, vote, participate. Leave it all on the field this November. Stay safe, wear a mask, be healthy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zerlina.
Thanks for listening to this week's Afterwards podcast. Subscribe, rate, and review us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also send us an email at podcast@c-span.org.